Chapter 5 continues to give instruction regarding sacrifices for sin and begins with a number of examples. They are each regarding unintentional sin. We saw in Peter Hatton's video on chapters 3 to 4 that there was a difference between unintentional sin and intentional. And for the intentional, he used the phrase sinning with a high hand. This comes from Numbers 15 verse 30. The phrase high hand is direct from the Hebrew, though some translations render high hand as defiantly, which is fair. In chapter 5, there seems to be examples of sins which are more to do with negligence or carelessness rather than malicious, flagrant law-breaking. There appears to be no sacrifice for this kind of deliberate sinning, or sinning with a high hand. Here in chapter 5, the person is guilty of some error and there is a delay in realizing it. Once it is realized, it is confessed and the prescribed sacrifice is given via the priests. Again, we see provisions for those who are poor or really poor. Even a grain offering is acceptable to atone for sin if a person cannot afford birds. Note also the language about bringing something to the Lord, examples of which can be found in verses 6 and 7. The ordinary person, or even tribal chief, is commanded to bring some offering to the Lord, but this phrase means to the sanctuary, whether it is the tent or the later temple. The ordinary person, the non-priest, cannot actually come to the Lord directly. They are not ordained to make the sacrifice, to manipulate the blood, nor to enter the sanctuary. It is the priest who makes atonement for you. So the phrase to bring to the Lord is in a sense personal, because the intention of the offerer, whether gratitude or guilt, is what is being expressed to God. But at the same time, there are exclusive elements. The Lord's presence is not just anywhere. It is located in one specific place. And there is no direct approach to him. It must be mediated and controlled by his priests. Furthermore, the specific sacrifices are themselves prescribed. No one can decide to offer just this or that. Despite all these regulations, we should not lose sight of the graciousness of this system. It represents an unknowable God who has made a way for this chosen people to know him and to be with him. Thus, these laws are not supposed to be a burden, but a guide, an instruction manual for worshipping, being forgiven, and for being holy, both in the ritual sense and in the sense of character. The use of blood is, of course, critical. As Leviticus will tell us later, the life is in the blood. Blood became a metaphor in the Bible for violent death. The importance of blood was not in its life force per se, but in how it represented death by the loss of that life force. How it is applied or manipulated by the priest is also very important. It could be dashed or sprinkled against the altar, or poured out at the base of the altar as a libation. In other cultures, such an action would be interpreted as feeding a chthonic deity, that is, a deity which lives underground. In Israel, the blood represents the death as substitute, not to empower a subterranean god, but to cleanse the offerer of sin or guilt. When Moses made the covenant between God and the people of Israel in Exodus, he sprinkled them with blood. We see this language used in 1 Peter to describe Christians as those sanctified by the Holy Spirit and sprinkled with Jesus' blood. From 6:8 onwards, we see now God addressing, through Moses, the priests. One of the things instructed is the tamid, the daily offering. This was a burnt offering in the morning and evening, and here in chapter 6, we find the instruction to keep the offering on the altar all night, and not to let the fire go out. Thus smoke would be ever rising up in the camp, signifying the presence of God and his availability, even during the night. It is this daily sacrifice which, when stopped, was particularly disastrous, because it ground to a halt the basic operation of the worship of God. This happened when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in the 6th century, and again later when Antiochus IV, a Syrian king, forced it to stop in the 2nd century. This was spoken of in Daniel 8, verse 11. In the final verse of our section, chapter 6, verse 30, we see the instruction that nothing can be eaten, even by the priests, of the sacrifice whose blood was taken into the tent. We saw in chapter 4 that for priests and the whole congregation, the blood was taken into the tent and not just applied to the altar, which was in the courtyard. Thus again we can see there are different levels of holiness and seriousness which are expressed in the rituals. They offer us a wonderful 3D picture of worship and life with Yahweh, which carefully regulated people, clothing, time, space and possessions, all in the service of the one true God.